Fundamentally, your duty as a banker is to know who you're dealing with. And if you don't, then you risk riding with the devil, and that's what AlnaBank did.
Who's in charge of it all?
Shell company, shell company, shell company, shell company, holding company, another shell company, another shell company. The company at the bottom of the charts owns the one that's supposedly at the top.
Who's giving the orders in there?
What politician will disclose his interest? Yes, I award contract to my family. Yes, I approve license in return for profit share. Yes, I sit on the boards that approve bribe payment to the colleague in the ministry.
We need to know. We need to know.
A few corrupt politicians here, but a tax evasion there, even money laundering. I mean, okay, we can deal with it. But when someone mentions the words terrorism and proliferation, blood runs cold.
I would remind you, we are talking about people and outcomes so terrifying, their merest shadows would send you screaming into the nearest mental institution.
Long before the crisis which engulfed it in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century, AlnaBank, one of the largest and most prestigious financial institutions in the world, had weathered the great pandemic of 2020 to 21, only to meet the fresh problems that came with the subsequent global crisis and recession. Forced to take government bailout money to plug massive losses occasioned by bond defaults in its investment banking division, the 150-year-old bank set about sorting out its problems and regaining its independence.
At the forefront of its effort to grow its revenues and rebuild its balance sheet was the Global Relationships Division, or GRD.
Founded on AlnaBank's successful asset management business, GRD had grown into one of its most profitable business units, which saw business growth double between 2023 and 2025 through a potent combination of aggressive cross-selling of the bank's wholesale and retail products and a fierce commitment to client satisfaction and to meeting and exceeding business targets.
The feeding zone for the GRD guys was, you've got an investment manager for a pension fund who can introduce you to a board director at one of the investee corporations, who can feed you investment banking business, at the same time introducing you to a lot of private wealth management opportunities in amongst the senior management of the company, cherry-picking the best business in the bank. Very aggressive sales practices. I would say they were not that popular though, because it was always, sorry, how much did you make last year?
As the crisis eased, as growth returned and banks like Alna started to grow their revenues again, it proved necessary to remind people of a core principle underlying the bank's management of money laundering and terrorist financing risk. It was called the risk-based approach.
Well, the best analogy for the risk-based approach that I could give would be that of driving a motor vehicle. Now, if conditions are sunny and clear, if the road is straight and well known to you, well, you just probably grab your keys and go. And you go as fast as you're allowed to when you're driving. In other words, you drive appropriately for the level of risk which you perceive. But if it's raining, if it's dark, if the road has lots of obstacles and dangers and you don't know it that well, then you prepare more thoroughly and you take more care about what you're doing. You drive more slowly and more cautiously. Now, applying that to a bank like AlnaBank, whenever it took on a customer, it was required to assess that customer's risk profile according to a predefined set of criteria. The country of residence, what type of business they were in, the types and sizes of the transactions they were likely to undertake, and then to assign a risk rating to that customer, now either high, medium or low, which in turn would determine the extent of the due diligence, normal due diligence and monitoring for low-risk customers, and enhanced due diligence and monitoring for high-risk customers.
AlnaBank's customer due diligence policy contained detailed requirements on how clients should be categorized and what documents and background checks should be obtained and made. Early on in the process, the bank decided that the customer-facing relationship managers in divisions such as GRD needed assistance with the process, and so the Business Unit Support Group, or BUS, was formed. The idea being that hard-pressed relationship managers focused on bringing new business into the bank would be able to call upon the unit for support and assistance. But what developed in practice was a disconnect between business acquisition and business risk assessment, which started to cause problems.
To me, it took what should be more of an art and tried to turn it into science. Now, instead of having to answer to just one simple question, namely, what is the risk that this potential client could be a money launderer or could pose reputational risk to the bank, now instead we are filling in this form, that form, a matrix, 20, 30, 100 questions. They, who have no revenue target or responsibility, are telling you, we need evidence that he sold his company 7 years ago. We need to see the certificate of incorporation of 20 subsidiaries in different countries. If I tell you, one of the things they developed was a new system. It cost tens of millions of dollars to capture all of the information about every new customer, to screen them against the blacklist, to anticipate the activity on the account. This was an amazing contraption, which I'm sure they all loved very dearly. And it was called the NCA, the New Customer Acceptance System. But already it was known by us on the first day in relationship management as NCA, no clients anymore.
Against this background, the asset management team at GRD in AlnaBank was approached by a Cypriot investment firm, J. DeLea Investments, with a proposal to place €1 billion under management, with more to follow if investment targets were met. The amount was significant enough to trigger interest, and initial due diligence against DeLea revealed that, although small, it was properly constituted and regulated in Cyprus, a member state of the European Union, and had been in existence for 20 years, with no adverse publicity. The issue at question now was, where had the money come from? Or more precisely, did Alnan even need to ask that question?
The relationship management people are aware that under AlnaBank's own AML policy, because DeLea is incorporated and regulated in an EU country, it's entitled to be designated as low risk. They also know that under the applicable international standards that then the bank is entitled to rely on the due diligence done by its own client, as long as they, i.e. DeLea Investments, agree to it. Easy. We don't have to do our own due diligence. On the other hand, the BUS people instinctively want to take it further. And they know that the ultimate responsibility for meeting those requirements still remains with AlnaBank. They also know that places like Cyprus and Malta received heavy inflows of money from Russia and other countries of the former Soviet Union during the 1990s, of who knows what origin. So they're saying, we need to look behind DeLea and see what's there.
These divisions between GRD and the Business Unit Support Group now surfaced at a more senior level in the form of a dispute between Daniel Johnson, the business director responsible for the GRD, who thought that further due diligence wasn't necessary, and Ottilie Marks, the group head of compliance, who thought that it was.
It fell to Group Chief Executive Greg Jonas to make the final call, and he sided with Marks. But the support appeared to come at a price. In his email to Johnson and Marks dated 17th May, he wrote, "As decided at Mancom, we will make the further inquiries which you, Ottilie, recommend. Indeed, we should always ensure that our anti-money laundering procedures are capable of withstanding the sternest scrutiny." But then he continued, "Nevertheless, my job is to see that both the business acquisition and business control units within the bank are pulling together, understanding each other's positions and supporting each other, and I am not convinced that this is happening. We have demanding targets to meet going forward in the next 2 financial years, which will only be met if we work as a team. please note for the future.
Well, the BUS team gets hold of the Delea records, and then there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that Delea's client is indeed one of a group of companies headquartered in the former Soviet Republic of Moldavia, the Xavier Group. The good news is that there are some records, you know. There were copies of corporate certificates on the file, information from local newspapers about the business activities of the group, and the names and passport copies of the directors of the different companies, etc., etc.
Talk about complex structures. Shell company, shell company, shell company, shell company, holding company, another shell company, another shell company. The company at the bottom of the charts owns the one that's supposedly at the top. And you have to ask yourself, when you see a structure like that, what is the reason for that structure? And is it there basically to disguise beneficial ownership?
Complex arrangements and complex structures are not in themselves evidence of wrongdoing. Any program of acquisitions without any corporate restructuring will result in a complex structure. In countries suffering from high levels of official corruption, complex structures are used by the owners of businesses to disguise the extent of their wealth to avoid demands and threats. But of course, complex structures work equally well as a way of disguising illicitly gained wealth. The key point is that, regardless of the structure and its complexity, you need to know who is the beneficial owner of the wealth represented in that structure.
This requirement to find beneficial ownership is required by international standards and by applicable national laws. Beneficial owner being described as the natural person who ultimately owns or controls the customer and or the person on whose behalf a transaction is being conducted. It also incorporates those persons who exercise ultimate effective control over a legal person or arrangement. AlnaBank's intended Cypriot clients had, it appeared, peeled back the complex corporate structure. What it revealed was that the ultimate beneficial owner of the ex-Xavier Group was a Moldavian lawyer and businessman named Yulian Garbov, who the partners at Delea Investments had apparently met, and upon whom they had conducted due diligence which didn't reveal anything significantly negative, except that one of the Delea partners had apparently heard a rumor from an undisclosed source that Garbov had close ties with an unnamed Moldavian politician and that he sometimes looked after his business interests. But they had been unable to find any further information on this. Garbov himself had denied it, and media stories about him didn't mention it. Indeed, they made much of his lack of political connections in a country that was famed for them. But many have questioned the extent to which Alna should have relied on the quality of its prospective immediate clients' due diligence. Chuck Martin, a senior investigator with ISS Group, the International Business Intelligence Specialists, is a veteran of more than 300 investigations in former Iron Curtain countries. Reviewing the due diligence information available to AlnaBank through Delea, he is scathing about the weight of reliance placed upon it.
In my experience, it's simply not credible that a professional person such as a lawyer and accountant would have been the ultimate owner or controller of a structure of this size and type. They just don't seem to have control over these amounts of wealth, not in this part of the world anyway. So let's look at the sources of the local information. You have to understand that in countries like Moldavia, it is really incredibly simple and easy for people in power to manipulate publicly available information in a way that suits them. For example, one of the sources relied upon by Delea was Moldavian newspapers. As a Westerner visiting Moldavia for the first time, you may pick up this paper at the reception of the hotel where you're staying while you're waiting for your taxi to take you to your meeting. And what is interesting to you is that there are some articles in there that are kind of critical of the government, which is intriguing because you've always been led to believe that all opposition is stamped upon. So that makes it more credible in your eyes. So you stick it in your case and you take it with you. What you don't know, of course, is that the circulation of this paper is exactly 9 copies, 3 each for the reception areas of the only 3 hotels in Krestenberg where Western business people will stay, written specifically for your consumption. So all of this, to me, is classic red flag material. A complex structure, a beneficial owner who isn't like a beneficial owner ought to be, information which comes from convenient or questionable sources, the rumor from the unnamed source. It is all pointing in one direction.
That Garbov was fronting for someone else?
Yes.
Someone in government?
Yes.
The issue of a potential political connection was important, not just because of its ownership and control implications, but also because it would have made Garbov a politically exposed person, or PEP, defined in AlnaBank's own anti-money laundering policy as
individuals who are or have been entrusted with prominent public functions, either domestically or in a foreign country. For example, heads of state or government, senior politicians and their senior family members or close associates, as well as members of senior management in international organizations.
Now, PEPs are higher risk than other clients. A senior civil servant can accept a bribe in return for the grant of a business license. A cabinet minister can secretly own a company and then make decisions in government which directly benefit that company. They can conduct insider trading with prior knowledge of important government decisions. Now, even if they're not up to any of this stuff, they often possess high media profiles, which means increased reputational risk.
the applicable laws and international standards contain specific requirements if clients themselves are PEPs, or if they're owned and controlled by PEPs. Financial institutions are required to have the capability to determine whether or not someone is a PEP, and senior management approval is required before a business relationship is commenced. The source of the PEP's wealth must be established, that is, the economic activity through which the client's wealth has been created, and the relationship must be the subject of enhanced ongoing monitoring. But the corporate appetite within Alna for pushing this particular point was starting to wane.
This is very, very common when you are doing business, particularly in a developing economy. You have rumor here, rumor there, someone says something to you. Is it true or not? You don't know. And you know to do business simply because someone says to you, oh, he was a front for Vladimir Putin, or he was involved in organized crime in the 1990s. And remember, these rumors can be put around to hit a competitor, because they know that Western banks will run a mile before they do business with such a person. So yes, due diligence is fine, but at some point you have to make a judgment call.
We, of course, we're saying we need to look further, but in compliance you're always aware that you have a limited capital to use up. You can only say no so many times. My sense, this was above my pay grade really, but my sense at the time was that most, if not all of the capital, had been used up in the fight about whether or not to do due diligence on Delaya's client. And I think a calculated risk was taken at senior levels, that if there was a problem, we would be able to show that we had done enough.
Soon after, the head of compliance, Ottilie Marks, wrote to the head of GRD, Daniel Johnson, informing him that due diligence was now complete and that the Delaya accounts could be opened, but stipulating that notwithstanding that the ultimate beneficial owner, Yulian Garbov, was not deemed a PEP, nevertheless his, Johnson's, sign-off should be obtained, and that the accounts should be subject to enhanced monitoring by the business on at least a biannual basis. Johnson's sign-off was never in fact obtained, but fund management accounts and administrator and custodian accounts were opened anyway. And despite the initial promise of €1 billion, in fact more than €3 billion of investment funds were initially received from Delaya. With the opening the following year of a direct correspondent banking relationship between Alna's New York branch and KVP Bank, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Xavier Group, based substantially on Delaier's due diligence against Xavier, the pieces were now in place for what followed.
In September 2025, the main opposition party in Moldavia was swept to power on the back of mass protests following a rigged election.
A series of corruption trials followed against members of the previous government, one of whom was Vasily Chernov, the former Minister of Transport and Communications. Revelations during his trial that he had accepted political donations from Moldavian businessman Radovan Kaltan caught the eye of journalist Judy Shimanova, who had been investigating Kaltan and his connections with Moldavian organized crime.
Radovan Kaltan was suspected by the Moldavian police for a number of years as being a major player in people trafficking, drug trafficking, smuggling alcohol and cigarettes, and so on, not just in Moldavia, but in the region too. Everyone had known that he was an associate of Minister Hernov, but before the trial, nobody, myself included, had known about the extent of his political donations to Hernov. So that got me thinking, what did he get in return? Because there was no obvious sign of the award of government contract or anything obvious like that. I already knew that Kaltan's companies did a lot of businesses with Xavier Group, and then a colleague of mine reminded me of a previous allegation to the effect that Xavier Group was controlled by unknown senior political figure. So I started looking into the Xavier Group using non-public information, primarily from ex-employees.
What Shimanova found was that hundreds of millions of dollars had moved from companies controlled by Radovan Kaltan into various Xavier Group companies, pursuant to invoices issued by those companies. She also discovered money moving the other way, against invoices issued by other suspected Kaltan-controlled companies.
Many of the invoices were for the things which are quite difficult to quantify or prove, like consulting services, film rights, intellectual property for industrial designs, retainers for outsourcings and provision of staff, retainers for rental premises. And once those funds were received by those two companies in Xavier Group, Valnor Services and Valnor Group Solutions, they were then, I was told, be transferred to the account of Xavier Group Pension Fund and then transferred to the account in Cyprus. That is what I was told.
At the same time as Judy Shimanova was investigating the link between the Xavier Group and companies controlled by Radovan Kaltan, fresh information from the new government in Moldavia was also being made available to the US government in connection with their ongoing surveillance of Islamist terror groups operating in the Middle East and Central Asia. Of particular interest to the US authorities was intelligence concerning previously unidentified links between Moldavian organized crime and an extremist Islamist group by the name of the Messengers of God.
A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that there's little or no connection between groups engaged in organized crime and groups engaged in terrorism. In fact, the studies of the last 15 years or so reveal just the opposite. There is sometimes a symbiotic relationship between crime groups and terror groups who may cooperate if the circumstances make it expedient to do so. Now, in the case of Moldavia, what was found was that the main criminal group, which was controlled by Radovan Kaltan, who was a Moldavian national, they were running lucrative prostitution, gambling, and alcohol rackets in neighboring Baluchistan, for which muscle and protection were provided by the Messengers of God. Now, in return for this, the Moldavians provided relatively sophisticated money laundering services to the Messengers of God, enabling them to use funds originating in Iran for conducting a series of transactions in US dollars.
With their newfound knowledge, US investigators tracked the sums involved through various Moldavian shell companies. In each case, the funds ended up in accounts in one Moldavian bank. KVP Bank.
I received a phone call from somebody from United States Embassy in Christenberg. They wanted me to go there. They knew that I've been researching connection between Vasily Chernow and Radovan Kelton. When I was there, they played me a tape which had been obtained by a police when they raided one of the Chernow places. And when I heard it, I knew immediately that my hunch had been correct.
Ты волнуешься о прослушке? Не надо. Все под моим контролем в любом случае. Или ты думаешь, что меня прослушивают мои собственные люди? Вообще так. Есть кое-какие друзья. Хорошо, что? Ну, друзья или друзья друзей. Да. 8 миллионов они кладут в банк. Кладут и забирают. Без проблем. Ясно? Так что делать-то? Что за смысл? Это твои продажи, твои сбережения.
The tape appeared to reveal Yulian Garbov taking instructions from Vasily Chernov for the use of Xavier Group companies for laundering Messenger of God funds. Shimanova had found her smoking gun, and the way was now clear for one of the biggest anti-money laundering investigations in history.
There were sources within the opposition party and within Moldavian intelligence who knew that the real owner of Xavier Group was Vasily Chernov. We had already advised this to clients.
In a coordinated series of moves, police in New York, London and Frankfurt today seized documents and computers at global financial group AlnaBank.
Suddenly people are crawling all over what you did, and your due diligence, which you persuaded yourself would be enough, starts to look pretty shaky.
The jury heard details of the plan by the messengers of God to try and explode a dirty bomb in downtown Manhattan.
Okay, he says, what pension fund? I don't have a pension. I didn't know there was a pension fund.
Did you believe that Yulian Garbov was the ultimate beneficial owner and controller of the Xavier Group?
The due diligence process that we had completed
Mr.
had
Johnson,
revealed...
it is a very simple yes or no question. Did you believe at the time the accounts were opened that Yulian Garbov was the ultimate beneficial owner and controller of the Xavier Group? Yes or no?